Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you here today and attend what I think is an extremely important and hopefully very interesting conference for India and also for the many participating countries that we have here today. In the next, hopefully 20 minutes, I will provide a broader overview of the international situation on system integration of renewable energy and emphasize, according to the subject of this session, some of the policy, market and regulatory interventions, but also provide a bit more context of the state of play for the discussion. Now let me see whether I can move this forward. Yes, excellent. So this is the outline of the talk. Before I go into the substance itself, I'd like to briefly share some information about the International Energy Agency. I think most of you will be familiar with our flagship publications such as the World Energy Outlook or the Energy Technology Perspectives. We had a change in our senior management in 2015 when Dr. Fatih Birol became executive director. And along with that, we have a strategy of modernization, which rests on three principal pillars. The first is opening the door to new members, to emerging economies. And it's great for us at the IEA, and hopefully as well for our Indian counterparts, that India became an associate member of the International Energy Agency this year, which lays the foundation for a deeper collaboration between the IEA and India for the years to come. Second pillar is to become a hub of clean energy, energy efficiency, but also renewable energy. And the third component is to expand our mandate on energy security from our core business, which is oil, to also extend to natural gas and electricity. And you can see that the topic of system integration of renewable energy is actually at the intersection of these three priorities. And therefore, we've established a dedicated unit at the IEA for this topic and will, over time, also increase our work in this area. So much for the context of the IEA. Now, let's look at how different countries compare in terms of the current levels of generation. We measure it here compared to generation, not demand, as in Thomas's presentation, so we have some differences here. And what you see next is our forecast over the coming 5 years out to 2021, how these shares will develop. You will see a new set of forecasts in our medium-term market report will be published in early October, so these numbers will actually go up somewhat. Now, two main messages on this. First, we see established countries, principally in Europe, that routinely deal with double-digit shares in annual generation already. On top of this, you see a large group of countries which over the coming years will move into having double-digit shares, around 10%, in annual generation coming from wind and solar power. And now this means that more and more countries will face similar challenges. And of course, these 10% in annual generation translate into much higher shares in certain regions and during certain times of the day. So this very much raises the importance of system integration strategies. Now, this does create a lot of anxiety in countries, and we do work a lot in countries such as China, but also Thailand, other emerging economies where deployment is ramping up quickly. And I think one point to make from the very onset is that variability is not a new challenge to power systems. I think to most of you this will be intimately familiar. I just bring one example that really drives home this point. We have here the load curve of 2 days in Brazil, regular day, the blue curve, and something odd happens on the red day. Now, this is not a major contingency in the system. This is not wind dropping away suddenly or solar creating problems. No, it is a soccer game as part of the 2010 World Championship. And the ramp rates that the system operator needs to cover here will have caused quite some issues in the control center. So you see here 3,300 megawatts in just 6 minutes as the halftime break commences, and people go to the refrigerator to get a cold drink, and then of course the refrigerator will cause electricity consumption. Now, surely the system operator will have watched the game closely to catch that moment where they need a lot of flexibility in the system. And similarly, a lot of renewables integration can be conceptualized at using existing flexibility, but this time mobilizing it in a way to cater also for the variability from wind and solar power. More broadly speaking, if I had to give this presentation maybe in 5 minutes, I would stop right here with these 3 main messages. First, very high shares are technically possible. While large-scale power systems, it's still difficult to operate them at 100% instantaneous penetration of wind and solar power, there are technical solutions that would make this possible in principle. Second, there are no problems at low shares, so first percentage points in annual generation, as long as a number of basic rules are followed. And I'll speak more about that later. Third, reaching high shares cost effectively really calls for a system-wide approach. And here, this is a radical simplification, not visually very appealing, but I think the main message is a crucial one. System integration is often conceptualized the way you see on the left side. We have the conventional system that we're familiar with. It's grown over decades. It has its problems, but we basically know how to handle them. And then we have this odd foreign object that starts growing on the system, VRE, variable renewable energy. And it's very tempting to try to make it more into a normal generator. Yeah? So to say, this is odd on the system, this doesn't really belong here, so let's try to find resources to make it more like a dispatchable generator. Indeed, that is sometimes a requirement that you see in countries, but it's a very expensive way to integrate renewables, and actually it's not very much scalable. If you look at what an approach is that is more useful and more cost-effective at high shares, is to broaden the question. To look at it from a whole electricity systems perspective and say, okay, we need to reconfigure the roles of all the different resources that we have on a system, and then come to a new equilibrium between generation, grids, storage, and demand-side response. And very much of the remaining presentation, I'll be going into these issues. Now, a good thing about integrating wind and solar power is that the problems that arise do not come all at once. We've spent a lot of work, a lot of time on trying to categorize different phases, to say, at this percentage you have these problems. Now, unfortunately, that's not really possible because systems are too different. Something that I do think is useful is to take the inverse approach, to look at the issues that are present and then categorize according to those. So we've identified at the IEA these 6 phases. The first 4 are the ones that are just limited to the power sector, and I'll be focusing on these. These phases of system integration that characterize different problems. In the first one, it's a bit surprising, is that variable renewables, wind and solar, are simply not relevant at the all-system level. If you integrate a few dozens of megawatts, a few hundreds of megawatts into a system that has many thousands of megawatts of generation, this will not be felt at the all-system level, of course, given that this is really that it's well managed in this way and interconnected. The second phase is when you start to see a difference between power demand itself and net load, so power demand minus the output from wind and solar. The system operator will say, okay, this looks different, but I can balance this with the resources that I have available on the system, maybe making some adjustments. The third phase is when flexibility really becomes a constraint, when you have to think about it systematically. Think of the situation in Germany we already heard about, not enough transmission capacity between the north and the south, frequent problems with dealing with this. Fourth phase is when system stability, so the response of the system to short-term disturbances, or the short-term response to the system, become the crucial issue. To save time, I won't go into this in any more detail, but what I do want to share with you is where we see different countries along this journey of system integration phases. First, most of the countries in the world are in the first and second phase of system integration. As you can see here on the image, we put India at an early stage of phase 2. Now, of course, this might be different from one state to the next, but on a whole country level, this is the assignment that we made. You see, countries, even the ones that have high shares such as Germany and many other European countries, fall into phase 3. Thanks to their nice interconnection into larger power systems, some of the phase 4 issues don't really emerge there yet. And then you see Ireland and Denmark in this fourth phase where stability issues become relevant. In the next minutes, I will briefly go into what we've done so far to address challenges in phases 1 and 2, give guidance on this, and then in the final part of the presentation, share some principles of how to deal with the challenges in phases 3 and 4. So, let's look at the initial phases, and what I'm saying here is based on a publication that came out earlier this year. It's called Getting Wind and Sun onto the Grid, and it's really written as a practical resource that looks at, first, some of the myths related to system integration and looks what's really true about them, and then goes into saying, okay, these are the priorities for phases 1 and 2. For the sake of time, I will not speak about them in detail, but this is, I think, a quite comprehensive list of all the myths that you tend to come across. And oftentimes, they're either unsubstantiated, or there's no real issue behind them for a number of reasons, or it's a miscalculation. And other times, there is some substance to it, but actually it only occurs at later stages in system integration. There are ways to deal with it. When we look at the phase 1 issues, basically, by definition, we only have localized problems. So making sure that at the point of connection of a certain VRE project, there are no direct issues. And second priority is that the technical connection standards are appropriate in this location. If you do these two things, you'll probably keep yourself out of trouble in phase 1. In phase 2, and I think this is probably the one that is most pertinent to India currently, you already see it gets more complex. Instead of just 2 priorities, you see 4 here. It's much more explained in detail in the publication. And I'll just go through these 4 briefly. The first one we started with, and Thomas Ackermann also stressed this point, is whether there is an appropriate grid code in place. Because simply, this is the time to have a coordinated process to put in place a grid code that is forward-looking and that makes sure that you don't get into trouble later on in the system. Some of the big threats to security of supply with high shares of wind and solar power have actually come from ill-conceived grid codes. Basically, we have a computer in these power plants, and how to configure the software is critical for ensuring security of supply. Second, we have all the issues regarding whether wind and solar are reflected in system operation. This means, can you know what is coming on the system? Do you have a forecast system? But then also, can you react to it? Can you control the dispatchable generators in real time or close to real time? And also, can you control wind and solar power appropriately? Third component refers to the grid, upgrading the grid as far as possible to make best use of existing capacity. And then most importantly, put in place a planning process that anticipates future needs correctly. The fourth component, and we've actually made an entire study that came out late in 2016 on this question, is whether wind and solar power are deployed in a way that is the best way for the system. In the past, when wind and solar were extremely expensive, going for the best resource and just looking at that usually was already optimal from a cost-benefit perspective. As wind and solar are getting cheaper and technologically mature, actually this optimum is shifting, and finding the right balance of resources and making them help the system becomes a critical step. All right, so let's look at the challenges, issues as we go to higher shares. As I've already mentioned, here a systemic approach, systems approach, is what's crucial. In this illustration, you see on the left-hand side the level of wind and solar as it goes up. We first have a block of measures that target the overall power system. The first one being how the system is operated and what market structure is in place. Usually, this is a way of extracting flexibility from the system that is inexpensive, but nevertheless, it can be difficult to get. Simply because changing operating procedures, putting in place such systems can take time and face resistance. Second component of this, as we go to higher shares, is to make sure that a portfolio of flexible resources is invested in and available when needed. Often there's a push to immediately go to an option such as battery storage, while in fact this is quite expensive and often not needed until you get to very, very high shares or for some niche applications. Looking at a systematic expansion of the grid, making sure that electricity generation is flexible to its maximum, and influencing the shape of demand also in terms of the regulation that are in place, for example, for energy efficiency, can be a more cost-effective option. And then on the left-hand side, we see different options that are available to make wind and solar more friendly to the system. For sake of time, I won't go into details in this. The basic idea here is simple. Right-hand side, make the system more accommodating for the renewables. Left-hand side, make the renewables more accommodating for the system. Takes both. And of course, the policy and market frameworks surrounding this are crucial in making sure that this works in a harmonized way. There's also another component to this system transformation. Oftentimes, the discussion will start at the technical level to say this is technically difficult, maybe even impossible or a big challenge. As technical solutions emerge, it then shifts to the economic layer, saying this could be expensive, we need to look at regulations, market design, planning frameworks. Something that does not surface in the discussion very prominently is the institutional component. So the roles and responsibilities. And oftentimes the big barriers are here. But the discussion is probably also the most politically sensitive in this area, because nobody really embraces change when it reaches the institutional level. So the coordination between different entities, who is allowed to do what, whether you need to consider larger changes in the structure of the entire sector. Just one question, how are we doing on time? Okay, yeah. I'll just provide one example and guide you to where you can find additional examples on how to achieve such a systemic approach and the measures you can take for reaching high shares. This is a publication that came out just 2 months ago. It looks at best practices that we found around the world in terms of achieving system integration, more than 24 of examples of technical interventions and market design. Just one example here is the flexibility of power generation. You see here the fleet of coal power plants in Germany during 1 week of May in 2016. And you see that these plants are operating very, very flexible in concert. We've actually identified flexibility of power plants as a key priority, in particular in emerging countries such as China and also India. And within the framework of the Clean Energy Ministerial, the IEA is serving as the operating agent for a campaign on advanced power plant flexibility. India is a member of this campaign, and over the coming months until the coming summer, we'll be working together to identify best practices, both on the market design and the technical level, to unlock flexibility from power generation sources. Now, I will take a bit of time on this slide, given that it really speaks to the heart of our session. When we visit very many and very diverse and different countries, what I've found striking in the past year or so, or 2 years, is a convergence of issues when it comes to market design and regulation of the sector. Now, when I'm saying market design, I'm not saying you immediately have to put in place a liberalized wholesale electricity market, but I mean the overall economic governance of the sector. The first priority that you see in all countries that see an influx of wind and solar is how to achieve an efficient operation of the power system. And here, I would say some kind of short-term price signal is indispensable. This can be achieved maybe through a market. You could achieve it differently as well, but automating this process and putting in place feedback loops that go beyond standard regulatory interventions, because these can be quite slow and take time to implement, but automating this to have short-term price signals, I think this is a crucial must-have to go to phases 3 and 4 of system integration. Next point is unlocking flexibility from all different flexible resources, and there in particular the demand side often has a hard time to get consideration and to get off the ground. Third component is security of electricity supply. What happens to power plants that see less operating hours and that might exit the market but still need to be there for security of supply, at least in the medium term? Also here, creating an appropriate safety net is a priority in many countries. Fourth, how to get sufficient investment in clean generation capacity. So what contracting frameworks, remuneration schemes are there? Wind and solar are extremely capital intensive, and therefore reducing the cost of capital is critical. And finally, how to price externalities, how to level the playing field is something that remains a priority. I will skip over this component, not to say it's not important, but equally important is I think that we all get food at some point. So let me summarize. First, at the onset of deployment, challenges are often smaller than expected. There's already flexibility to integrate wind and solar. We can group challenges according to different phases, and the measures should grow proportionally as we go from one phase to the next. Wind and solar can actually help to minimize these challenges if the regulatory frameworks are appropriate, and if you actually look at the value that this electricity provides to the power system, not just the levelized cost of generation. And finally, to reach high shares cost effectively, really a true system-wide approach is indispensable. Thank you very much.